Ananth, have you turned off the waiting room thing so people can join in without you having to let them in?
That's okay. I'll still, be able to let them in. I can see the thing. So
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
wait, just give me a second. Yeah, I think I'll just let them in as and when they come. All right, everyone, and welcome to our 7th session of Roundabout. This is going to be about the Bronze Age and the Bronze Age civilizations. I'll begin with an apology. This is going to become a bit of a history lesson. I sort of debated this over, and I thought that before we get into the Epic of Gilgamesh, we need to know a little about the background, because we're talking about ancient Mesopotamia. Most of us know little or nothing about it. And to, try going into an epic without any background knowledge, it's just going to become another lecture when we do that. So I thought it's okay, we'll have a short session, but we'll discuss a little about the background for the epic before we do the epic itself. That being said, I would really love it if people pitch in with their ideas. If you've got questions, I'd really appreciate it if you'd ask. So anytime during the course of the session today, you can just unmute yourselves, and if you've got something to say or ask, please do ask. I know it's going to be a bit of a one-man show, but we'll try and make the best of it. All right. So just 1 minute. Sorry. Right. So if I was to, put the whole of history into a single slide, this would be the slide. One fine day, some 1.3 billion years ago, one of our monkey ancestors decided that they were fed up of walking on 4 legs and wanted to walk on 2. And from there, our story begins. And for thousands of years, we're talking about, about 16,000 years, we just used stone. It was just stone tools, very rudimentary societies. Everything is very, very basic. And then somewhere around 6,000 years ago, during the 4th millennium BCE, magic happens and we discover this shiny new toy. We discover copper. Now, the thing with copper is, unlike stone, you can shape it into pretty much whatever you want. You can melt it and cast it into whatever shape you want. Stone, you can't do that. Stone, there's very limited options for what you can do. But still, old habits die hard. And, we didn't really want to get rid of stone. So we continued using stone. And that period is called Chalcolithic. Both chalcose, copper, and lithium stone. So both were there. At some point, probably by pure accident, we also discover that if you added a few other things to copper, you made copper harder, much stronger. And that's how we end up with bronze. And bronze, revolutionizes things. That's why we often say that the Bronze Age is the dawn of civilization. And then something very peculiar happens at around 1800 to 1200 BCE. Everything that we have achieved in the Bronze Age disappears either completely or partially. And we go back to a very primitive state. We will talk a little about that as well. And soon after that, the big bad boy on the scene, iron, appears. And till this day, we are still in the Iron Age. So if you look around you, the most commonly used metal is still iron. So we're still in the Iron Age, and the Iron Age, sort of dominates most of history. So a question to all of you. I would like answers in the chat box. You know, what is civilization? What is the first thing that comes to your mind when I say civilization? Just, quick words would do. All right. There's organization, there is trade, system of people, settlement, community. Um, I am a little surprised. Okay, social hierarchies, cities, great complexity, cultivation. Okay, culture too. Yeah. So when we talk about civilization, we assume it to be, culture, art, music, writing, everything else. Basically, something that's not barbaric. You know, we are not we are not cavemen anymore. But you ask a historian, what is civilization, and a historian will give you an answer that goes into several books. But then you tell him, boss, I don't have time for this. Tell me one word or one concept that you would say this is civilization. And that answer would probably be urbanization. Cultivation we see beginning in the Neolithic period itself. We see social organizations occurring very early on, right? We see some sort of language developing very early on because that is the characteristics of humans. But when do we say that civilization has arisen? We say that only when cities make an appearance, and the cities make an appearance for the first time in the Bronze Age. Prior to this, there are no cities. So if somebody tells you, I've heard of the Stone Age city, then you can tell them that, you need to go back to your history. There were no cities in the Stone Age. The cities begin with the Bronze Age. And all the cities, this is something we have heard from our school days, that they came up in the river valleys. Why river valleys and what role did the river valleys play, we will look at next. But they came up in the river valleys. I'm sure at least some of you are wondering, why did cities suddenly spring up in the Bronze Age? The answer to that question is that the previous slide, we talked about the different ages. See, that was an extreme oversimplification. Nothing that we see in the Bronze Age, suddenly started with the Bronze Age. The predecessor processes were already happening, and they come together in the Bronze Age, and that's why cities rise. It's a little too much detail to go into, in a session like this. But if any of you is interested, you can read it up. There's a lot of debate today about how exactly cities came to be. Very interesting. So this is, the Bronze Age civilization, the different Bronze Age civilizations. And I note here. Yeah. So can you all see the marker? Can you just let me know if you can see the red thing? Yes. All right. So look at where all the Bronze Age civilizations have turned up. You see one in Harappa, that's the one that we are most familiar with. That's along the banks of the Indus. We then see this little thing in China, that's the Shang civilization in China. That's also along the Hongo River. Here we see the Mesopotamian civilization. That's where our focus is going to be. And we see that's along the Tigris and the Euphrates. We see the Egyptian civilization along the Nile. And I want you to also pay a little attention to this little spot here, the one that says Minoan, and the one above that here in Greece, which is the Mycenaean civilization. When we think of Greece, we think of Athens, of Sparta, of philosophy, of democracy, and so on. It doesn't start with that. Greek history actually begins with the Minoan and the Mycenaean civilizations. We don't really know too much about either, but it's a very important part of Greek culture. Pranav, I believe you are very interested in the Iliad, and if you've read about the Iliad, you would know that most of the cities and things that are described in the Iliad occurred in the Bronze Age. So we are actually looking at, the cities of Troy, of Menelaus. These are not the later Greek cities. These are all in the Bronze Age. And although you can't really make out here, there are many small rivers and streams there. They form the basis for those cities as well. Just a side note here, this map is of what we call the Old World, which is Africa, Asia, and Europe. There are other Bronze Age civilizations in Mesoamerica as well, the Incas, the Aztecs, and the Mayas. But these are not from the same era. Like if you see here, we're saying it's 3000 to 1500 BCE. The American civilizations are all about 400, 500 years old. By this time, we had already started killing each other with gunpowder, and still they had not discovered the use of metal. So technically, they are also Bronze Age civilizations, but we don't really consider them with this lot of civilizations, primarily for the reason that, well, as I said, uh, they are much later. Okay. So what are the main features of uh, the Bronze Age as such? First of all, bronze is used, obviously, and it was used, as I said, because it was easy to shape. Uh, it's interesting note that when compared to stone tools, bronze actually doesn't offer you too much of an advantage in terms of strength. Both of them work just as well. But it's mainly the fact that you can cast bronze into whatever shape you want and you can reuse it. You can just melt it and reuse it. So that is what made bronze a very popular thing with our ancestors. Then we said urbanization, or the rise of cities. Now you must remember that cities are not just settlements. Villages are also settlements, and settlements have been there for much longer than the Bronze Age. The the when we talk about cities, what we are talking about is huge public buildings, monuments. We're talking about craft specialization, which means that in a village, everybody is farming. Among them, there might be somebody who is making tools, who is making jewelry, or some kind of an extra activity, but it's not a full-fledged specialty. Now, in cities, what we see is that there are people who are making tools. There are people who are conducting religious ceremonies. There are people who are administrating, other people, and they're doing just that. They're not, producing any kind of food. They are not involved in agriculture at all. That is the characteristic of cities. They don't produce food on their own. And of course, cities are very large centers compared to villages. They are more crowded. They have a different demography altogether. And as I said, cities do not produce their own food, which means that somebody has to produce the food for the cities. So there's this one of agricultural surplus. So in the early days of agriculture, when about 20,000 years ago when it started, agriculture was just sustenance. You produce just enough to feed you. By this time, the amount of food being produced was much in excess of what was required for the producers themselves. So there could then emerge a group of people who did not indulge in agriculture, who were doing other things. And that's how cities came up. These people congregated and cities came up. If you remember in the previous slide, we said that all the civilizations came up along the banks of rivers. That is actually the reason why agricultural surplus came about. Agriculture started in the mountains. It started in the foothills because that's where the vegetation is not very dense. And then, as and when people began to expand agriculture, they cut down more forests, they converted more and more land to agriculture. They realized that if we go further down into the valleys, the soil is more fertile, we are able to produce more food. So they first moved into the valleys. They moved into the valleys, there was agricultural surplus. Agricultural surplus meant that there was more time on hand, and time meant craft specialization, and craft specialization in turn led to urbanization. So it is a natural migration of humans that gave rise to urbanization. And once you say that a few people are going to produce food and the rest are just going to eat it, you start seeing an emergence of social stratification. Some say, you're lower down in the pyramid, you're just producing food. And, I'm doing the more skilled work. So this creates that peasant ruling class dichotomy, but that's not just a simple classification. There are other categories as well, and we will look at that a little later. And once you have large populations, large amount of food is coming in, going out, you can no longer do your simple counting by making tally marks on the wall. You need something more complex. And maintaining accounts is no longer, how many heads of cattle do I have? How much wheat did I grow? It now becomes a question of how much wheat was brought into the city. Who sent that wheat? Where was this wheat stored? When was it sent? Who distributed the wheat to people? How much was distributed? Why was it distributed at a particular time? So all this had to be entered, and that you cannot do with just tally marks. So we see the emergence of writing, a complex system of writing, to help with all this. And obviously, once you develop writing, you cannot say use writing only for accountancy work. People started using it for other things as well, and one of those was we began using writing to record stories, to record legends, myths, epics. And that the product is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's basically writing being used for creative expression. So we'll go back to the river valleys now. We said all cities were located in the river valleys. The problem with river valleys is, yes, you can grow a lot of food, but there is nothing else there. You don't have large rocks and stones, which you can use to build structures. You don't have precious metals. You don't have, wood. These are all things that are present in the foothills of mountains, or they're present in deserts, in the sort of places where you can't grow much food. So in order to procure all this, people in the cities, kings, the aristocrats would organize trips to these areas where, hundreds of people are likely to travel together. They mine whatever they want, they cut down as much wood as is required, and then bring all that back to use in the cities. And you see any of the epics, starting from this time, or even if it's set in this time, long journeys, these quests are very important parts of those epics. That's because the nature of civilization was such that, to get basic things that you required, you had to go long distances. Of course, it follows that if you're not having something with you at the moment and your neighbor does, then you trade with them. So in Mesopotamia, we find records of trade relations with Harappa, we find records of trade relations with Oman, some with the Greeks. So there is a very wide network of trade. Egyptian cotton is turning up in India, Indian beads and lapis lazuli is ending up in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So there is a lot of trade as well, and a lot of stories revolve around such trade. So a lot of myths, a lot of legends grow up around kings sending trading missions and those kind of things. And all of this causes a social churning. You're no longer just somebody's son. You're no longer from one particular family. Your status in society is determined more by the nature of the work you do, the social prestige that you have, and sometimes on the religious beliefs also. There's a lot of debate whether the changing religious beliefs led to social changes, or whether it was social changes that gave rise to religious beliefs. But whatever it is, your position was no longer just kin based. That's why if you see the Epic of Gilgamesh or even the Iliad, you don't have too many people going, he's from this Gotra, this Vamsha, you know, this Jati. It was more of, he was a blacksmith, or he was a trader, or he was a soldier. All of that goes into that. There's not much about family and tribe and so on. And of course, religion, we can largely trace, the growth of religion to this period. But religion isn't as we see it today. It's not one particular aspect of life, it is life in the entirety. And religion was largely based on natural forces, which means that gods were not the benevolent, merciful, loving fathers of later time. They were vicious creatures. They could drown thousands of people in a flood because they were bored. And if you didn't want to get drowned, you had to, make sacrifices. You needed to conduct religious ceremonies to keep them happy. But if you kept them happy, gods could be nice, loving people. So we see this all the time. All these features are reflected in the epics, the stories uh, of that time. And yes, Pranav, the Iliad, basically the gods are interfering in everything. They're behaving exactly like humans. Uh, and that's true even in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gods are not, just passive bystanders or the par above. They are pars pretty much operating in every aspect of your life. So this slide is something that, we will be looking at constantly when we read the epic itself. And this gives a lot of context to what the epic is. So I said, social stratification, and this is roughly what the social stratification looked like. You had the king on the top, and every uh, level below that was based on how important you were perceived to be. The king at this stage is not, as much a religious head as he is a secular head. The priest is the religious head, who's the one talking to God. Below him, you have a lot of people who are involved in, keeping track of taxes, of keeping track of different things. They're administrative, basically clerks. Then you have soldiers who are mostly part-time. Then you also have artisans, craftsmen, traders. These guys are the ones producing the tools. They are the ones involved in crafts. Below that, you have free peasants. Now, free peasants means that they have their own land, they're cultivating their own land, and they have certain rights within the structure. And then you have the slaves at the bottom. The slaves don't have their own land. They are not free to do anything. They're basically working for somebody else. And this structure isn't fixed. So in Egypt, for instance, there are records which say that families would work as administrators for 1 month of the year, and for the rest of the time they would, go back to their farms and cultivate crops. Soldiers, as I said, were often part-time, so most of them were peasants who at the time of war would be called up to fight in the armies. Only the artisans, craftsmen, and traders, they were likely to be permanent jobs, and the priest and the king, of course. Even the king, for that matter, at this stage was still not a hereditary thing. A king was very often uh, chosen by the people. And Prerna Sparta is not of the Bronze Age, it's of the Iron Age. So bringing Sparta in here is a mistake. Uh, that being said, slaves were also not a very important part of the structure just as yet. Slaves were sort of secondary. So what did they do in their free time? Now agricultural surplus to mil gaya. There are a lot of people who don't have much to do. So some sat and contemplated the meaning of life. Some formed literature clubs and pestered their juniors to write things. Some, went into the visual arts. Some planned big buildings, grand structures, and a few others went into sculpting and model making and so on. So the result of this is what we often perceive as culture, right? Yeah, GP, you can go ahead.
I'm sorry, that was my mistake. Please carry on.
All right, all right. So, looking at Mesopotamia particularly, what were the places that Gilgamesh, if he had been a real person, would have visited? What are the places he would have heard of, and so on. So this is Mesopotamia, and you can see these are all cities. Uruk forms the center of the story. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk. But Uruk was not the only city. Ur was a slightly older, a bigger city. Eridu was another very important center. Nippur and Kish were in their days, pretty powerful cities. And we must also remember that this is a time of city states. So cities were countries in themselves in a way. It is somewhere towards the middle of the Bronze Age that one city conquers another city, and we begin to see the emergence of kingdoms. Now, a lot of people refer to these as empires. Historians don't really agree that these are empires in the true sense of the word. So they prefer to use the term kingdoms. And if you see, there are two main things marked here. One is Akkad and one is Sumer. This is based on language. Sumerian is a language, which is not like any other language that we have. So it's sort of like a lost language. Akkadian is very closely associated with the Semitic languages, Hebrew and Arabic, and has a lot of similarities with them. But the overall structure was that of unity in diversity. There would have been common elements that you go to any city, you would be able to identify. But they're not exactly the same either. Each had their own god, they had their own rituals, they had a different set of cultural norms, but they also had a lot of things in common. And this is the setting for the story. All right, so I'll just quickly go over to the chat box. A lot seems to be happening there. The Kannada word Uru related to Ur, no. I mean, Uru develops almost 2,500 years later, right? It's unlikely. This is just, pure coincidence. Okay, the only thing I know about Sumerian is stick letters in the Rosetta Stone like thing on a cliff somewhere. You're right about the stick-like figures. That's called cuneiform. It's not really stick, it's more of wedge. But the Rosetta Stone is more commonly associated with the Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's basically a trilingual thing with Greek, hieroglyphic, and something else. So that's how they got to translate the Rosetta Stone. It's not related to cuneiform. Cuneiform is the language of the Sumerians. It continued, it's a writing system, and it continued very late into the historic period as well. Even into the Iron Age, people were still using cuneiform. Okay, so this is about the area that Gilgamesh would have lived in. So people we know wrote stories. They wrote a lot of things to keep themselves entertained. What did they write about? There's ideals of kingship. Gilgamesh is a king in himself. There's a lot of heroism. There's stories of friendship. Some of you might be familiar with the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Then there is the theme of love. It has to be there everywhere. Death and immortality. This is something that, the entire book almost seems to revolve around. There is this journey to wisdom. Gilgamesh in the beginning is this, very arrogant, uh, very boorish king who then becomes a wise king at the end of the story. So this is one of the journey, and the human condition, which is the most generic thing you can say about pretty much any story. It's supposed to be a reflection of the human condition. So these are the same things that are written about in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'm sure if you were to go through any of the epics of the later age, it's still the same. This is more a way of showing you that, these are things that are not going to go away. Uh, they maybe with the exception of the ideals of kingship, the same thing fits Harry Potter as well, today, a good 4,000 years after the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's not at all peculiar that these were the same themes. Yeah, Rohan, you're right. More of a best friend. Enkidu turns out to be a very close friend for him, and when Enkidu dies, this whole question of what is death, what is immortality starts. Then something very peculiar happens. Between 1800 and 1200 C, cities are suddenly abandoned. Writing declines, and in the case of the Harappan civilization, it completely vanishes. Agricultural output, we know, somehow fell. Trade networks collapse completely, and the Harappan civilization, among them, some civilizations vanish. Both the Minoan and the Mycenaean civilizations, just disappear from our record after that. So this is what some call the Bronze Age collapse. Yeah, a lot like the Armageddon. There are some questions about, was it a collapse at all? But there are people saying, it's too much of a coincidence that across the globe in this 600 years, cities suddenly collapse. What was once prosperous goes for a toss. So the sort of, 7 crore question. What caused the Bronze Age collapse? So the Egyptian sources talk about the sea people, launching raids. We don't know anything about the sea people beyond that. This is a time when there's a new kid on the block, and that's iron. Iron is more easily available. Copper and tin are rare metals. This is one reason why people had to travel a long distance to find these ores. They were not very commonly used. With iron now, anything and everything could be made of metal. You didn't have to rely on stone anymore. It was much cheaper. And chariots also make an appearance at this time. And this suddenly creates a sort of a gross military imbalance between the Bronze Age cultures and the Iron Age cultures, where the Iron Age cultures take over. And then there is records of long droughts, of sudden flooding, prolonged flooding. Basically, the gods were not being very nice. And some people have argued that, it was associated to some extent with not being able to find copper and not being able to find tin. Whatever the case, it definitely did look like things had suddenly disappeared. The Bronze Age had suddenly died. But then there are some people saying, you know what? Look closely enough and you'll see that they didn't die out. In Mesopotamia, for example, yes, the Bronze Age cities, many of them were abandoned. A lot of things that we associated with the Bronze Age does decline. There's a slight decline in agricultural production. We do see the emergence of nomadic barbarians like the Hittites, the Mitannis, and the Assyrians. But they eventually settle down, they adopt a lot of the Mesopotamian culture, the lot of writing and things just goes completely on block to uh, the Assyrians. And there's a continuity. There isn't really the end of the civilization. In Egypt, on the other hand, again, things don't just disappear. There is a long period of decline that begins in the Bronze Age, and finally it ends with the Greek conquest of Egypt under Alexander. Only in Harappa do we see this thing where cities are abandoned, everything goes back to a more primitive state, and then almost 1,000 years later, we see the rise of the Vedic civilization in the Ganga Valley. The Chinese, though, it's almost continuous. There is no break at all there. So, a lot of people now question this. They say, was there even a collapse? This looks more like something that just happened. Not really a cataclysmic event. Whatever that is, it's still a debate, still going on. I'll deviate slightly here. There's a very interesting side note to this. So, as I said, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Mitannis, they're all groups, they're nomadic groups that appear at the end of the Bronze Age. They're Iron Age cultures, they've got iron chariots. One of the interesting things is a treaty that was signed between the Hittites and the Mitannis invokes gods. And the names of all these gods they are very similar to, so similar to, in fact, that linguists say this is one and the same thing being referred to. They invoke the names of Indra, of Mitra, of Agni, of Varuna. So, and their language is very similar to the Avesti language that was spoken in Iran at a later date. So there is a question, a very valid question, were these sea people or the barbarians that appeared, was this the Indo-Aryan invasion that we see? We know that even in India, the Bronze Age culture of the Harappans was replaced several centuries later with the Iron Age culture of the Vedic people. So this is a big question mark. Is this the ancestry that we're looking at? Archaeologists and genetic experts are not very convinced that, this is the same thing. But the linguists say no. The similarities are far too many to say that these were not the same people. These were the same people. So it's still a big, big question mark. It's a very interesting theory, but it's still just that, a theory. Okay, Pranav, yeah, I said 1,000 years. 1,000 years between the disappearance of Indus Valley cities and the appearance of cities in the Ganga Valley. The early Vedic people were pastoralists, they were nomads. They didn't really have cities. They lived in small tribes. Prerna, where did they come from? Again, a big question mark. There are only theories that say they came from Central Asia. Some say, they came in the Indo-Iranian borderlands. Some say they came from the North Pole. We don't know. There is absolutely no archaeological evidence that without a doubt says that the people came from here. We don't even know if they're the same people. It might have just been a coincidence. We don't know. All right. So what's the legacy of the Bronze Age? We have great heroes, great battles, great love stories, stories of betrayal, our share of death and gore and glory and everything. Basically, Iliad, Epic of Gilgamesh, any of the Egyptian stories that you might have come across by now, all of them have got these things. This is really the beginning of all that. Prior to this, these were never common property or common heritage as such, right? The Bronze Age, this is the beginning of it all. So you have to credit the Bronze Age for every movie, big movie that's made. The themes and the things were first explored during the Bronze Age. So this is about the end of the session. This was all I planned to say. So if you've got anything to add or you'd like to say something, do unmute yourselves and go ahead. I mean, even random thoughts are fine. Uh, that's completely left to you. Any questions, any thoughts, anything at all, just unmute yourselves and go ahead. Prerna, you're asking too many questions.
Anantji, Gaurav here. One question can I ask?
Sure. Yeah, please.
First of all, we are thankful that you were able to explain it in a very lucid manner, and it was quite enthralling. I was just at the last moment pulled in by Prerna to attend this session because I have interest in history, but I loved the way you explained everything. So thank you so much.
I'm just as interested in history as well, so this has been a fun exercise for me as well.
No, it's a beautiful exercise, and we would definitely like to hear more sessions. One question I have is, you said what did they do in their free time? Look, in fact, that is something which we rarely pay attention to. We talk about their activities, but we do not talk about their leisure time. We know that a lot of forms of uh, dramatic arts, dance, theatrical arts started evolving since long. And usually when we talk about Thespian era, we study about Greek form of art or Western arts. But I want to know, did any kind of these arts start at that time because those people were relatively, in the leisure time, they wanted to do something? Did they start anything? Would you have any idea if there was anything which originated from Bronze Age, which we still practice today?
The thing is, we can never really tell for sure that something came from the Bronze Age or came from the Stone Age, because there is no archaeological record of that. And whatever writing we've found does not, there's nothing like, a textbook of dance or a textbook of music. But there has been a lot of studies on, tribal societies, which are still Stone Age or Bronze Age. And they have their dance, they have their, songs, they have their own ways of performing arts as well. So there is almost no doubt that even in the Bronze Age, something like that would have been there. We just don't know about it. And there's really no way of finding out also unless somebody invents a time machine where we can go back. But now that you brought it up, there's a very interesting find. This is a find in India. I've forgotten the name of the place. It's in Orissa. They've found what appears to have been a very primitive amphitheater. This goes back not even to the Bronze Age, it goes back to the Stone Age, where there are paintings of people seem in a sort of a dance on that. The arrangement, has a lot of features of acoustic significance. So yes, there is still a question mark. And logically think of it also, nobody is going to wake up in the Iron Age one morning and say, I'm going to start dancing. There's got to be some tradition, some backstory to it. So, the question of, was there a dance form? Was there a performing art form? Yeah, the answer is yes, there almost certainly was. But if you ask us what exactly was that art form or dance form, we don't know. That we're not in a position to tell.
Yeah. So my question was actually from the specific point of view only, that this particular dance form or a dramatic art which we practice today is a gift from the bronze. Yeah. But fine, I understand your point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Prerna, you asked about the Shastra, the Natya Shastra and Abhinaya Darpana. Yeah,
Yes.
they're all Iron Age, and we're talking about very late in the Iron Age. We're
I
talking
know. Yeah.
common
Natya
era.
Shastra is very old.
Yeah, we're talking about the Gupta period, around that, the Puranic age. This is much, much, much beyond that. The Bronze Age is way older than that. In fact, the only text in India which is likely to have originated in the Bronze Age is perhaps the Rig Veda. All the other texts came in the Iron Age.
Okay.
Anybody else? Any thoughts? Anything? Yeah, go ahead, Vallabh.
Okay, I just had a random thought. I had read that there's a lot of research done on the Indus Valley civilization, and it said that the language is probably Dravidian in origin. So that's why I I just put forth an open question. I'm sure it's not funny, but like, what if like there's a language even spoken now called Brahui near Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is Dravidian. Yeah, so that's just a thought I had.
The thing with the Indus Valley language is the script hasn't been deciphered. So we can't really tell, is it Dravidian? Is it Indo-Aryan? Is it something else? That debate always remains. There are. It's a very weird situation where genetics tells you one thing, archaeology tells you something else, and linguistics tells you something totally different. We are still trying to tie all these three together. The Harappan civilization, if you go into the debates, you're never going to come out of it. It's an entire rabbit hole in itself. The language alone, leave the rest of the Harappan civilization out. The language alone is something that has more question marks than anything else, I think, in Indian history. So yeah, there are a lot of theories. Go ahead, Pranav.
Yeah, so even in the map that you showed that was detailing Bronze Age civilizations, and as well as when I have looked up, I've heard the phrase Proto IndoEuropean a lot. Can you tell me why that is and what, can you tell me about that?
So, I spoke about these Iron Age people suddenly sweeping into the Bronze Age civilizations and taking everything over. There has always been a lot of debate about, who were these people. Until about the 1960s, 70s, linguistics was not something which was considered very important in history. Linguistics was always thought of as a completely different stream. But in the 60s and 70s, a lot of work that was done on languages showed that there is a very strong connection between Sanskrit in India, Persian, and many of the languages spoken in Europe. And when you go further and further back in time, particularly to the end of the Bronze Age, the number of linguistic similarities become too large for it to be a pure coincidence. Such as, for instance, in Sanskrit, the land of the seven rivers is known as Sapta Sindhu. In Avesti, which was the language of Cyrus and Darius from the Persian Empire, it is referred to as Hapta Hindu. That's where the word Hindu comes from. So when it's so similar, right, there cannot be a doubt that they came from the same root. And as I said, even with the Hittites and the Mitannis, which are, this is around Turkey, northern Syria, we see the evocation of gods like Indra, Mitra, Varuna. Early Iranian traditions also have similar gods and things. So there is the linguistic evidence is overwhelming that they all came from a common source. But in terms of archaeology, in terms of genetics, this is a different group coming to Europe. There's a different group coming to Iran. There is a different group coming to India. Archaeological evidence doesn't say that there's anything common between them. So that's why we just use the word Indo-European or Indo-Aryan, whatever you wish to use. These are the big mystery people in history. We don't know where they came from. All we know is that they probably spoke a similar language. Besides that, there is nothing else that we know. But these mystery people appear in all places. They appear in Egypt, they appear in Mesopotamia, in India, even China. There's evidence of nomadic attacks. Europe, though, a lot of groups appear. So, yeah, this is just a linguistic grouping. Linguists are telling us that no way this is a coincidence. This had to come from a common language. Prerna, were they probably the same guys? Who probably the same guys?
The people who went around conquering the Bronze Age civilizations, who took over those cities?
Yeah, that's what I told you. The language says, yes, they were all the same people. But archaeological evidence says, may or may not. Genetics says...
No, but did it all happen around the same time?
Around the same time, 1800 to 1200 BCE.
And was there any sort of evidence saying that, okay, there were probably more than these many settlements, like the big cities? Were there in other places, do we know of any cities as such that would have had the military power to go on campaigns like this?
See, that's the thing.
Nothing.
Our experience later in history has shown that it is not only the cities that produce the required military power. You take very, very late you take the Mongol invasions that happened in the 1200s. See, even there the Mongols did not have cities of their own. They lived in tents. They migrated. And still, when the conditions proved right, they were able to overrun huge tracts of settled land. And this is a pattern.
It makes sense that they came from a settlement because, that here we are talking about language and some sort of already present,
nomadic groups are known to have their own languages, are known to have their own cultures.
That strong, such that, it forms the basis of so many cultures worldwide right now.
Yes.
Wow, okay.
The Turks, for instance, they had a language of their own, they had a script of their own, they had cultures of their own. There are so many things that they had which came down to settled people. For example, in India, Khan, which is a very common Muslim surname, we all think must have come from Arabia or must have come from the settled Islamic lands. It actually is a Turkish word, and that word goes back almost to the Bronze Age itself. Khan is simply a leader in Turkish. And this is an entirely indigenous Turkish word. So it's not that nomadic people did not have cultures, they did not have languages or anything. They did not have cities. That is there. Cities were very, very rare in the nomadic world. But they had all the other things, and military might, many times, nomads would prove to be more powerful than city dwellers. The only difference was nomads were always small, divided groups. So it was divide and conquer. But the minute they united, they would overrun, entire empires. The Mongol Empire is a case to the point. So it's not that nomads did not have culture.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's about it. If anybody else would like to pitch in, we can take another few minutes to answer or to hear you out. So if that's all, then we'll get on with the presentation. So, so if you want to know more, what do you do? So one option you've got is there's this channel called Extra Credits on YouTube, and they have made a lot of videos about history. It's all animated videos, just 10 to 12 minutes long. Very simple, very funny also. They have made a video on a set of 6 videos on the Bronze Age collapse, and they have 2 videos on the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. So you might want to watch that to get a good idea of what the story is. We might not be able to go into, the big picture next time. So this is a good option. Can somebody please put up the links I had sent on the roundabout group onto the chat box? You'll be able to find the videos
Yeah,
there.
1 minute. Give me a moment. I'm
Yeah,
doing
sure.
that right now.
Then, of course, you can read big, dusty books. Not everybody's favorite. Or you can do a quick wiki search and then act like you're an expert. That also works. Whatever suits you best. So that's about all from me. We will have a session or maybe 2 sessions on the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. I have the text, been sort of preparing for it for a while, but I really don't know when I will finally get down to conducting that session. There's a lot of things coming up, so it might be a while before we have it, but we will eventually talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. So I hope to see you all there. And yeah, I think the videos are slowly coming up. Yeah. So you'll find them on YouTube. You can just do a quick search. All right. Thank you all very much for joining us. This will go up on YouTube as well. So see you all soon.